Test. No. Hello? No. Yeah, I heard it that time. It's picking me up. Yeah. Thank you.
Ryan, can you hear us? Can you unmute? I'm using you as my test.
Yes, I can hear you.
Awesome. Okay, thank you.
Yep, you bet.
The infinite corridor. All right. Let's go. Okay, well, folks, it's nice to be here. I feel like this is a little bit preposterous to stand in front of a lectern with about, 9 people in the room, but thank you for being here. And I know we've got more than 9 people if we include the folks who are viewing it on Zoom. So again, it is a pleasure to be here. My name is Ken Harper. I'm a lawyer. I represent cities and counties almost exclusively. And I was asked a couple of years ago to put on essentially an open government training presentation for Lake Stevens. That was in 2019. And recently Kelly got in touch with me and asked if I would come back out. It's really nice to be here again. I would like to give you an overview, but let's talk about some basic kind of ground rules, if you will, first. I've done this a number of times over the years, and it really works better when people ask questions as we go along. We've got a pretty small group, but if we include the folks online, I hope we'll get a little bit more activity, and Kelly and I are going to try to coordinate that by encouraging folks online to raise their digital hands. And if Kelly sees the hand go up, she's going to spot that promptly, give those folks a chance to ask questions. So for folks in the room here, just please stop me as I go along. The presentation is going to be based on about 2 segments. We'll go for 45 minutes for the first group and take a break. Then we'll pick up with the second set of issues. But the idea here is if there are questions, I am happy to bear down on what is particularly interesting to you folks or folks on the screen. And there are at least a couple slides in the first part that we can skip over to make up for lost time. So I'm just telling you, we're going to end on time. And if we go a little bit quicker on some areas that aren't really attracting a lot of enthusiasm, that's fine. Now, the second part I said is a little bit different, and let me speak to that. The second part of the presentation actually is meant to fulfill Washington's open government training requirement. So there's not much there I'm going to get rid of. We will need to spend at least, the 50 minutes on the second step of the presentation. And Kelly's already done a great job of getting us kind of queued up here. Again, my name is Ken Harper, and you're here for the Lake Stevens ABCs of the BCCs. One of the things that I learned over the years is it's not the most explanatory title. And I did one of these. It wasn't for Lake Stevens, but it was a few years ago. After the presentation, somebody came up and said, well, you never explained what the BCCs were. And I thought about it and I realized, yeah, I didn't really. So if you're wondering, the idea is to describe the elementary roles and requirements for a member of a board, a commission, or a committee. There's your BCC. So don't come up after and say, you didn't tell me what BCC. Everybody in the right room? Everybody ready? Okay. All right. Let me just kind of get a sense of who's here. I did some research on Lake Stevens. I know you guys have, like almost all jurisdictions, you have a planning commission, you have Parks and Rec. Lake Stevens has a salary commission, which is kind of cool. You guys have a library board, civil service, veterans commission. Anything else? Any other commissions that I didn't name? How about just a show of hands? Who here is on the planning commission? Right on, after my own heart. Okay, excellent. My main practice area, aside from just general municipal representation as land use. So I am speaking to planning commissioners, maybe with a little bit more emphasis, not taking away from our good friends in the library board or any of the other commissions, but planning commissioners are really in some ways the kind of the key liaison for city council on some very, very challenging issues. Again, without taking away from any of the other commissions, planning commission has a particularly interesting role because they deal with land use, and land use comes with it a whole special set of legal requirements. So if you're not on planning commission and you think I'm spending a little bit of extra time on those folks, I am. It's true. But I'm not going to try to tune anybody else out. And if you're on Parks Board or Library Board or Civil Service or Veterans, you'll just have to edit out a little bit of what I'm saying. Most of what I'm going to speak to will apply to all the boards and commissions equally. And at the same time, everything I say has a few exceptions. So it's just, realize that nothing is completely applicable. The other thing I'll mention, I said we're going to talk about some ground rules. Here's another ground rule. I'm a lawyer. I'm not your lawyer. I'm not Lake Stevens' lawyer. I'm not your personal lawyer. So one key from that is if I say something tonight and then you later get a question or you get a slightly different perspective on an issue that you maybe hear from Kelly or that you hear from your city attorney, listen to your city attorney. don't quote that guy who came that one evening and sounded like he was going to speak to everything under the sun. I am doing this on a very general level, and a lot of the issues that come up really take fairly detailed knowledge of specific facts, and I'll try to answer questions as we go, but I'll also have that caveat pretty often when a question comes up. I'll say, well, depending on, you get a different answer. And another point of this, really frankly, is to be a little bit more equipped in the legal arena so that you can spot the issues and raise them with Kelly or your city attorney. I don't know exactly what the path is for a board or a council or commission member to go directly to your city attorney. I don't think you're probably just going to pick up the phone and start calling your city attorney. But certainly, if you have a concern, if you see an issue on the horizon because of something you think you learned tonight, then that's great. That's really part of me doing my job, is to have that sort of issue consciousness. All right. So the first part, as I said earlier, we're going to talk a little bit about the sort of the basic role that you have as a member of a board or a committee or a commission. We're going to talk a little bit about council's expectations. Not that I've got any inside information on what the Lake Stevens City Council wants. I'm sort of blissfully unaware of local politics, local controversies. But I can tell you, after about 23 years of doing this, generally what makes for a good relationship between a commission and the elected officials, and what sometimes can come up as recurring areas of difficulty. I'll speak a little bit about that. We're just going to talk a little bit about how to run a good meeting. As a commission member, meetings are where the action happens, and I've sat through a lot of meetings, folks. I've sat through some good meetings, I've sat through some bad meetings, and the sort of the common themes start to rise to the top pretty quickly if you've been doing it long enough. Speaking of that, how many years have folks been involved in municipal government? Let's see a show of hands. Has anybody been involved on an elected or an appointed role for more than 5 years? Anybody have more than 5 years? More than 10? Yeah, we got some real war horses here. We got 4 digital hands up. Well, let's clear those out right now. Go ahead, Kelly. They're saying they have been. Okay, excellent, excellent. Well, good. That's great, because that gives you some real institutional knowledge then. And I'm going to assume that some of you folks are on different boards or commissions. So we've got a little sprinkling of institutional knowledge throughout the BCCs here. Then you don't need a lot about necessarily how to run meetings, but folks who haven't been on the board or the commission may be looking for some assurances on what makes for a good public meeting, or how to just effectively work within this public process. And then on the second part, the open government training part, we're going to discuss the OPMA. the Open Public Meetings Act. We're going to discuss the Public Records Act. And for folks who are on Planning Commission and Civil Service Commissioners, do I have a Civil Service Commissioner in the room tonight? How about online? Anybody, Kelly, showing up on Civil Service? Oh, come on. No? Civil Service Commissioners, we have a hand. Okay, I can see the hand. Great. Civil Service Commissions and commissioners and planning commissioners are subject to the appearance of fairness doctrine. So we're going to talk about that a little bit too. And that's one of those where if you're not on civil service or planning commission, it truly does have no applicability to you. So don't get sidetracked on appearance of fairness if you're not on one of those two. Slide. Everybody with me so far? Any questions on what we're doing tonight? Does that sound like a reasonable enough agenda? Yep, very good. And Kelly, this is kind of going to be a bit of a trick because a couple of these slides are meant to have bullet points that fly in. So why don't you fly in a few bullet points here? Folks, I otherwise would be doing this with a clicker, right? But Kelly is my clicker, so I've got a smart clicker this time. Okay, so I mean, the first question is why do Washington cities place an emphasis on having boards and commissions and committees? And the question is actually a pretty good one, because if city council could just do it all themselves, they would, theoretically. They wouldn't need the boards and councils and commissions, or boards and committees and commissions. But in fact, council can't do it all. There's a lot to be gained from having the liaison role of a planning commissioner or a library board or veterans board. There are downsides too. I mean, obviously you folks are giving up time. You're giving up time this evening, and certainly you give up uncounted hours attending meetings, preparing for meetings, reviewing materials after meetings. And so the question that could arise is, well, is it worth it? Why don't we do the next slide here, Kelly? And in reality, there is no other way to get the same kind of community input and community involvement without your help. Boards and commission members allow, and as you can see on the slide, allow and encourage and promote consideration of issues in significantly more detail and frankly with more richness and more value than frankly council can devote to it. And again, I'm not speaking to your council necessarily, but you've sat through, if you're here in the room tonight, you've undoubtedly watched or sat through lots and lots and lots of Lake Stevens council meetings, and you know that the ordinary business of the city council is everything under the sun. It's a tremendous volume of material, makes it very difficult to stay on specialized topics for any length of time. And frankly, sometimes it becomes very difficult to move an issue forward because there can be conflict, right? Not necessarily conflict between council members, although that's fair, that happens. There can be conflict between council and the community's expectations, and the council may just not have time to adequately engage with that conflict and try to reconcile it. That's where the commissions can come in. Why don't we do the next slide here? Another one that I'll comment on before, although I did say next slide. One of the ones that was good on that last one, if you have the printed materials, you can kind of go back and forth with me. The previous slide had the last bullet point about, yeah, there you go. Thanks, Kelly, about providing training for new leaders. And I've really seen that proved out over the years. It's really been remarkable how planning commissions or Parks and Rec, or even to some extent the other commissions, can be a point of access for folks to get involved in local government. And that's super important because not everybody is going to be comfortable, showing up in a community and running for council. You don't know folks. It's a big investment in your time. It can be a big investment in your money. But there may be an issue that you really care about, and you see an opportunity to volunteer in a particular board or commission, and next thing you know, you start learning more and more about local government and how it works and why it looks the way it looks. And it's natural as you begin to get that expertise to want to use it. So it's really true that planning commission in particular can be a launching pad for folks to get involved at the council level. Well, what else can you do by having these advisory boards? Well, you can get a better sense of what the community really supports. If you're on Parks and Rec, for instance, you have a lot of wish list items, but you have a limited budget and you have limited resources in terms of staff. What does your community really value? This is not the kind of thing that council can figure out on its own, but if you're engaged and you're participating with your community, folks get on these commissions not just because they are looking to advance in local government. They get on these units of government because they care. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is the folks who do participate really speak for a huge, typically they speak for a huge segment of the community that just doesn't have the time or the quite the level of interest to show up. I've seen that on civil service. I've certainly seen that with veterans organizations, and it's a great way to just add the advocacy role to local government. And sometimes, quite honestly, the benefit of the committee is to keep an eye on things. I mean, I got the little bulldog here, but in some communities that I've seen, the local gadfly who is furious that the city does X, Y, or Z, sometimes gets invited to join the commission and says, okay, I'll do that. That's great. Welcome to the club. Come on in, see how it's done. And if you think you can participate in making it better, have a seat at the table. So it can really be remarkable when you're dealing with an issue that is provoking controversy. And if you do it well, and if folks feel like they can be heard and listened to add some of that to the actual advisory board role. I don't know if Lake Stevens has difficulty filling these positions or if you have a line around the corner to join, but it can often be challenging, right? To have a quorum, to have a full board. Sometimes it's something you have to advertise and advertise and advertise. But if you do it openly and you've got a willingness to bring in all kinds of different viewpoints, I think you'll find that you're really better served. And there may be a lecture to council right there as much as the folks in this room, because I know that none of you get to appoint yourselves. But from just a boardsmanship point of view, it's okay if somebody has arrived on the commission who's got a very different perspective from the mainstream. Well, go ahead and slide. Yeah. Now, the thing that I've been speaking to as I've gone along so far that you can sort of tell is a key part of my perspective on this is that in doing work on one of these commissions, you're part of the local government team, right? You're independent of the city council, but you're on the same team. I mean, you're on Team Lake Stevens. You may be a dissenter, you may be a gadfly, you may be unorthodox, but you've still got to recognize that you're part of the organization. Go to the next slide there, Kelly. And what that means is that you're subject to some rules and requirements just because that's the way the law sets this up. I said a moment ago, it's fine to have widely different views and be still with the board or the commission, but it's not okay to just totally go rogue. I mean, and in fact, that usually has sort of a self-canceling effect. If folks are absolutely unwilling to pull towards some kind of common purpose, they usually get frustrated and they just stop showing up and they wind up having to be replaced. Well, that's not good for anybody. If they had had a better understanding of what they were being asked to do, maybe they wouldn't have joined in the first place. But after a few meetings where they're essentially being faced with the reality that there are limitations, they've got a lot of latitude, but there are limitations. Under those circumstances, sometimes it just makes the most sense to say it's not the best fit and move on to appointing a successor. Unfortunately, what I've seen often is the folks who really won't sort of embrace their role within the rules of the game they just become non-entities. They don't participate at all, but they don't resign either. So if you see that kind of a trend occurring, recognize that it would be good to try to pull that person around and bring them on board. If you're that person, then, think about it. What's not fitting here? What were my expectations in signing up for this, and how can I adapt it to what the city council can actually use? This is a little different for some of the members of the audience. I talked about that earlier. If you are on, for instance, the salary commission, then you really don't work under the auspices of city council, right? Because the whole point of salary commission is it's independent. Same thing for civil service. It's independent. Library board, parks and rec, planning commission, you're there as a point of access to city council. You're there as a way to fulfill a council purpose. Council may not know what the purpose is, but you're there to help them define it and then fulfill it. Okay, why don't we go ahead? We're going to skip a couple of these that I've already kind of spoken to. So why don't we pass that one? Yeah, let's talk a little bit about how to make this work a little bit. Any questions so far on how you found yourself on a board or a commission or a committee? What were you thinking? Why are you doing it? Okay, so far so good. Okay, so how do you get the most mileage out of the time you're willing to put into it? Boy, this is a really key part of the talk here, because unless you're on salary commission or civil service, ultimately what you're trying to do is you are trying to have a role in establishing some kind of policy, right? You're not on city council, you're not elected, but you're more than just citizen input. I mean, you have a formal role. And if you're going to have that policy persuasion, you need to either demonstrate to council why what you want is in the public interest, or you have to think of ways to bring council around and have council see that it's in the public interest. Sometimes it can be a long game that you may be playing. I've had communities that had boards or commissions that had a really vested interest in, it could be historic preservation, it could be view shed protection. I'm over in Eastern Washington, and we're having a lot of interest right now in developing alternative energy sites. And as you might imagine, we also have these huge expansive views because we don't have trees. and so folks are expressing concerns over whether or not we're giving up the sort of the far-reaching mountainous views that have never really been protected, because they're also not exactly like standing on the campus of UW and looking over the fountain at Mount Rainier. They're not quite like that. They're not like preeminent views, or looking at the Strait of Juan de Fuca or something. But you don't know what you've got until it's threatened, and so there's a increasing interest in things like viewshed protection. But that's not necessarily a problem-free kind of proposal. I mean, there are lots of issues at stake there. Do we have a hand going up? Anybody? No? Okay. There are lots of issues at stake there. And first and foremost, we have a policy in the state of Washington to encourage alternative energy. So if you want to have the ability to persuade council on some of these issues, whatever they may be, maybe historic preservation, I touched on that a moment ago too. It may not happen right away. You may have to gradually work your way to a recommendation that can be accomplished. Another community, I'm not going to name the name, but another community not far from where I live and work is really famous for having a very attractive, historically maintained downtown area. They are interested in being kind of on the cutting edge in historic preservation in Washington. It's a community that is a little reminiscent, I guess, of Port Townsend. It's very established with brick structures, lots of live work that's kind of been well integrated into the existing downtown inventory. And it's hard to keep that when there's so much pressure for more housing and new types of development and new ways to make these spaces work when the old systems, the old structures are somewhat difficult to maintain and expensive. Well, but as soon as you really start advancing something like historic preservation with teeth, it becomes clearer that folks are being asked to give up some of the expectations that they had previously. And if you're involved in something like historic preservation, council may ask you to work on that topic for a while, because it may not be possible to pass legislation on something like one of these thorny issues until the community is ready to speak with some sort of coherent voice. Sometimes these board and commission roles are sort of there to catch spears, and take some of this pressure off of council. Planning Commission in Lake Stevens, I know you folks, you're going to be doing the 2024 comprehensive plan update, right? That's coming your way, if I didn't misunderstand your website. There's going to be a lot of challenges there, I suspect. I don't know exactly what's on the docket for Lake Stevens, but anytime you're opening up your comp plan for a full update, you're going to have a lot of issues to be thinking about, even aside from the normal future land use map revisions. So you've got to be thinking about how are we going to move this toward a consensus view that may look like a reasonable policy? Because if it's just a wish list, it's probably not going to go very far with council. Let's go ahead. Yeah, Kelly. All right. Speaking of Planning Commission and the 2024 comp plan update, well, I'll tell you one thing that really helps, and this is not just for planning commissioners, but as a board or a commission member, you guys have the ability to do some neat things involving the community. Open houses, websites, special outreach meetings, work sessions that maybe can be scheduled more flexibly than your ordinary commission meeting. All of those things are ways to get community input. In planning, one of the laments, and I do a lot of work with city planners, one of the common complaints is, well, we worked on this throughout the comp plan update, and this is what we came up with. And now, XYZ developer, property owner, or neighborhood opposition group or whatnot, they're really mad because, we're going to have to approve this. And this contradicts our comp plan. Well, what kind of feedback did you get when this was going through the conference? Well, nobody was interested in it at that time. That's the problem so often. And whether you're on planning commission or you're involved in another board, it's the policy setting that really makes it possible to then go execute the policy. Policy setting for the planning commission is easy because the policy really is the comp plan. For the other commissions, the policy typically is set through your budget priorities, which I realize is a council function, but you have a tremendous amount of influence in helping council understand how to allocate those funds. So if you're not getting lots of community involvement, I know it's hard, but if you're not at least trying, I guess, to get lots of community involvement, you can find some folks really fairly upset when they realize that what happened, is a ship that's already sailed and really can't be dealt with at that level now. Surveys are great. I've seen a lot of fairly intriguing surveys that have been promoted through web pages. Sometimes folks have a really difficult time showing up at meetings or even sending in comments, but if there's a web page that's hyperlinked in a news article, folks will click. And then once they get going, they'll start clicking through and they'll give you input. Now, is that as good as coming and speaking for 3 minutes in front of the planning commission or the city council or whatever? Well, probably not, but it's not either or. We're at a period now when folks are just very, very comfortable participating in a digital format. Everybody's got access to all kinds of different points of contact. And if you think about ways to use those, there may be opportunities. On the Lake Stevens website, you guys have lots and lots of interface opportunities, so that is all very positive. I just don't know if you think there are opportunities to branch out even further from that, but give it some thought. And again, for you planning commissioners, get real, because 2024 is here. Okay, let's keep going. All right. We're touching on the same issue here. I'll just add one point from this slide that I've certainly seen on a number of instances, and that's the next to last bullet point. Your local Lake Stevens staff may not appreciate all the concerns that affect the community because they're staff, and in the community you will have vested interests, particularly from the business sector. Sometimes just regular citizens will have special interests that can be shared. But a lot of times the issue comes up when a staff directive just doesn't necessarily match what the real world can accomplish. And sometimes this is to do with regulatory matters. It can deal with, again, a resource or a budget allocation issue. But I found over the years that through the role of these commissions and committees, you really can get some valuable input from the private sector. Staff's not necessarily as in tune, or staff may be pretty in tune, but you still don't always get some of the sharp elbows that you may get when you propose something and then give folks a chance to come speak to it. And frankly, sometimes it can feel like you're getting a little bit beat up on those things, but it's so much better to have those sharp elbows thrown when you're in that phase. You're trying to figure out how are we going to move this forward than it is after you've taken that step and something has made it to council or it's actually been decided, and then you may run the risk of having a deeper dispute. Okay, let's keep going here, Kelly. As far as running meetings, so I said we're going to talk about some of the policy behind why we're going to have these advisory committees, and we're going to talk about how to run meetings. We're on to that segment now. There's really just no substitute for doing the work and being prepared. I know that's kind of boring, but I can't emphasize it enough. And unfortunately, I've had a number of clients over the years where the first time, and I'm not even going to pick on any boards or commissions because the one that's coming to mind right now is actually a city council. The first time the council is being confronted with the issue, I can tell they're reading their staff materials as it's happening. So, this problem is unfolding. And folks are, starting to get hot, and the city attorney at the end of it all is going to say, okay, well, we need a motion, or the clerk's going to say, or the mayor's going to say, we need a motion, and the discussion up to that point has not meshed with the decision criteria, right? And that's really challenging, because if you are involved in local government, you want to see good decisions get made on the right reason, because you don't want to see those things get caught up in media controversy. You don't want to see those things get caught up in heaven forbid, litigation. So you need to interpret these sometimes rambling discussions into something that actually makes sense. It's the next to last bullet point on this slide, something that makes sense with the decisional criteria. Well, your staff report, if you're on a board or commission where staff is interacting with you, and I appreciate that, library board may not get a lot of staff support, but some of you folks certainly do. Boy, you've got to dedicate the time to understand, why is the staff report saying what it's saying? And sometimes the staff report may not be all that articulate. So you may have to get it well enough in advance and engage with it soon enough that you can say, I've read this and I've read the Lake Stevens code, and this still isn't making sense to me. But the point of the slide is to try to do that and be able to go back to staff or whoever's running the show and just acknowledge that this isn't making sense. You know, I don't understand. Why are we saying that, you know, this rezone is going to be denied or recommended for denial for X, Y, Z reasons? That doesn't, I don't get that. It could be an issue of something very, very detailed. It could be a traffic count methodological issue. It could be a code interpretation that's just not really obvious, or it could just be that staff said, you know, recommend approval, and they meant to say don't recommend approval. You know, there's lots of ways that this could be wrong, but I really can't emphasize enough that come to those meetings ready to roll, and it really pays. If you don't and things drift, it really gives folks a headache, and it's unfair to the other folks on the board too. You probably all have that experience where someone is being dragged along and not really prepared to engage, and then in the public eye, you know, somebody has to decide: are we going to say that that's not relevant, with the risk that that person then gets offended and, you know, feels shut down? You don't want to have to do that if you can help it. Okay, Kelly, let's go to the next one here. Actually, would you go back one, if you would, Kelly? That slide on focus on decision criteria, that slide bullet point, focus on decision criteria. I'd really like you to retain that. Yeah, no, you got it. Keep going forward now. I'm sorry. Yeah, no, you did good. Keep going. One more, and then one more. Yeah, right. Yeah, and okay, but go advance one more, and I'll just talk about decision criteria a little bit more. The point of the decision criteria is just this: the way that you get a persuasive result is if you can show that you have made some kind of reasonable judgment from what was presented to you with the code criteria. That's where the rubber hits the road. So if you're drawing from purely personal experience and it's not anything that happened in the meeting room, that could be a problem. There has to be something in the public record that supports whatever that decision. You could add that to the public record, nothing wrong with that. So that's one component, is you have to make the decision criteria deducible from the public record, but it also has to be the right criteria. Okay, so that's the other component, is right criteria. So one of the things that I like to recommend is if folks are involved, particularly in an actual decision-making role, ask yourself, if a motion is being proposed, maybe you're proposing the motion, or you're thinking about whether to second it, or it's in deliberation, and you're trying to decide which way you want to vote. Ask yourself just a really simple question: this motion should succeed because why? And then force yourself to answer the question, because what? Because we heard this tonight, and it matches up with this set of factors. It's amazing to me, as often the city attorney that's involved in typically a council meeting, where unfortunately something may have gone off the rails, because if it stays on the rails, I'm not even needed. But if something has gone off the rails and it's not looking like it's going to lead to a defensible result, I will have to be the one to say, well, you know, Honorable Mayor, I'm not sure I've heard the explanation for why this is in the record, or why this matches the code criteria. And I think we need to come back to that. And that's challenging, because it is essentially saying you're off track. You're on the wrong subjects, and that can be interpreted sometimes not so kindly when everybody's on TV. So if you're involved in that role and you're asking that question because you're doing yourself a ton of good. Okay, in terms of conducting meetings, some of the basics are just almost go without saying, but we're here to say them tonight. So some of the basics: show up on time, end on time. We're going to end on time, I hope. Make sure you participate, keep an open mind, ask questions. It's okay to disagree. It's best if you disagree on the reasons that you say you're disagreeing, instead of having sort of hidden secondary issues that really don't get raised. And I don't think that's common, but certainly can happen. It's really important to have appropriate body language. It's appropriate to treat. What do we do the next slide here, Kelly? Yeah, it's really appropriate to treat folks who are coming out and speaking, who are nervous or who are poor public speakers or who are hostile. It's really important to treat them with the same courtesy that you treat anyone else. You really will find that it's the inflammatory folks who tend to cause the room to go haywire. And the soonest way those folks can have that effect is if they provoke a reaction from somebody in an official capacity. You may think you're a volunteer and you're just on this commission, and if you didn't run for anything, but to the folks in the community, this is a somewhat intimidating environment, and you're in a position of authority, and you are. That's part of that being a team player that we talked about earlier. So just as a judge in a courtroom will tend to just listen patiently and continue to listen even after the judge is pretty sure that he or she's not going to hear anything at this point that's going to change his or her mind. You just show respect by listening and being attentive and respectful. It helps to not pass notes back and forth. It helps to not have your phone out. I've had a couple of pretty nasty public records cases over the years where the commission, council, whatever it may be, is dealing with a controversial issue, and someone won't want to email because very careful about creating public records, but someone will scribble something and just pass it to their neighbor, and their neighbor looks at it and raises eyebrows. And next thing you know, you get a public records request for that piece of paper. It may not be something you wanted to produce in the public, but the first principle here is act like somebody is looking over your shoulder at all times, and just do it in a transparent, open way. Avoid having too much chitty chatty personal conversation. It's nice if you're on a commission where everybody gets along. That's great. Sometimes, though, you can have cliques form, and there'll be a few folks who are sort of in the club, and the other folks are not. That's awkward. It's just better in general to have a professional, even tone, and save the less serious topics for some other venue. I understand Lake Stevens is a small town, and I imagine everybody serving on these boards is pretty well familiar with everyone else. But Lake Stevens is getting bigger like crazy. It's getting bigger. I'm happy to be here tonight. I'm particularly happy to be here because I managed to get through those roundabouts. I wasn't sure. Those weren't here in 2019. I just zipped right into your CBD here, but it was remarkable to. We've got roundabouts. I've driven through roundabouts. I haven't driven through those roundabouts before, but it's just obvious. Lake Stevens is really bursting at the seams. Are you guys the fastest growing city in the county? You've got to be close to it. Yeah, pretty much so. Yeah. So you're going to see lots and lots of fresh blood, folks who want to come on these boards and commissions, and just recognize that they may not be part of the old network, but I think by keeping your business on a business-like tone, it makes it friendlier in a way. Being friendly and chitty chatty is not always what works in this setting. Okay, Kelly, let's hit the next one there. Okay. Yeah, this one kind of emphasizes what I talked about earlier. The idea is to produce good, usable recommendations or decisions or what have you. That really requires that you follow these well-trod paths. If you want to be completely unhinged, then this is probably not the best role for you. You may find that you get asked to be on the board anyway, but you do need to work within the box. You do have to be familiar with what your board can and can't do, and explain what you're doing. Be logical. I keep emphasizing that. Keep asking if you were on city council and you got this decision or you got this recommendation, would it make sense? Would you be able to engage with it? Would you be able to explain it? Would your constituents just as quickly as possible vote you out of office or start a recall petition, whatever? Think about that, because that's again, that really is your audience in a lot of respects. Okay, Kelly, one more. Yeah, this is kind of the capstone of the first part here, and it pulls together what I've been saying really throughout this. I don't want to belabor it, but if you've been listening to what I've been saying all along, it's about having a well-rounded approach that sticks within the rules of the road. And even if you do that, you're going to have disagreement. One of the challenges you're going to face, and this slide does not attempt to resolve it. One of the challenges you're going to face is whether or not you're working toward consensus on the issues that come before you, or whether you're working to get to a vote, a majority vote. I don't have the answer to that, but think about that. There are some kinds of issues that come before you where it may be really important to reach consensus. That you may just need to have the time and the, I guess, the endurance or whatnot to bring the minority position into the recommendation so that there isn't a dissent. It's not going to be a, 5, whatever it is, 5-3, 4-7, whatever, 5-4, whatever your 3-4, whatever your quorum plus majority would be. Other times you just got to get a vote. I mean, you just have to, and there may not be any way to reconcile the minority view, and sometimes there may be an intermediate position where you would like to get consensus, but the clock is forcing the issue on you. Your comp plan update is going to be one of those where it would be really valuable if Lake Stevens could have a consensus view on some massive comp plan update, but you're obligated under GMA to finish this update process by a deadline. And if you're using up your time and you're not getting the minority perspective integrated into your recommendation, you got to move on, right? Other areas, perhaps library, parks and rec, even veterans, it can be really valuable to have that consensus view and be able to go to council and say, this is the unified position of this board on this particular topic. It can have a lot more persuasive effect than having a hard vote with a minority that feels like it did not get its way. That's okay though. I mean, majority vote's fine. I'm just emphasizing that it's not always the goal. I said we're gonna go about 45 minutes. We've gone 46 and a couple, so we're gonna pause right now, take a break. And then what we're going to do when we come back is we're going to check off the open government trainings topics and put a little fear into your hearts. Yeah, and particularly as we go into the second part, I really encourage questions. So I want to make sure that folks are getting what I'm saying, and you're almost sure to have questions. So it's been a quiet room tonight because it's small, but stop me and we'll take a few minutes. So I do want to end promptly at 8. And right now, as I said, we've been coming closer to 50 minutes. So why don't we just take about 5 or 10, walk around the room, get a drink, get a cookie, and I'll see you back at, I said see you back at 7. So let's take 10. audience there again? Okay. And a last minute cookie raid. All right. Okay, blood sugar is critical for these things. Okay, guys, so it's 7 o'clock. We're in the home stretch here. And if you left early, at home, you're not going to get your open government training certificate. So you just sat through that first part. You don't get the payoff. One person left. All right. Well, maybe the person who left's already got the training, and there's no score in the Mariners game, so you're not missing anything. Plus, the way they've played lately, you don't want to know. Okay. Do we have fans? I mean, yeah, we get Seahawks jersey, Seahawks business there. All right. Well, I went to one of those Dodgers games. It was brutal. Okay, we're gonna talk about the Open Public Meetings Act. Kelly, actually, why don't you hit the next advance it? Yeah, it's funnier when I do it, but it's not gonna be funny doing it this way. Anyway, we're gonna talk about the Open Public Meetings Act, and then we're gonna branch out to a couple of other sort of public participation laws. Has everybody in the room had some kind of training on OPMA before? Let me ask a different way. Has anybody not had any training on OPMA? Yeah, good. We got a few folks, and I'm going to assume there's a few folks at home that have not been exposed to it either. It's probably frankly, it's probably the key part of the legal presentation tonight. So I really encourage folks, ask questions about OPMA. The other two parts of this sort of more legalese version of the talk, the second part of the talk, like I said earlier, is the appearance of fairness doctrine. That's pretty straightforward, and it doesn't come up all that often. And then Public Records Act. The Public Records Act is going to have a couple of components that are really important for folks in this group, but by and large, you have a pretty minimal role in helping Lake Stevens in a very important role. Don't get me wrong, but a fairly minimal role in helping Lake Stevens fulfill its Public Record Act obligations. The Open Public Meetings Act is different. The way you guys conduct your business under the OPMA is really important for so many different aspects of personal exposure and also the credibility of what you do in Lake Stevens. And the folks who have to be on the front line policing that are really you yourselves. So let's talk a little bit about it. Go ahead, Kelly. The OPMA applies, as you can see, to basically any of the entities that we're talking about tonight. It applies to boards and city councils. It applies to school districts. It applies to mosquito control districts and irrigation districts and public utility districts. Okay, so it's very, very broad. It applies to basically any kind of government agency. It applies to committees. That's sometimes lost. So if you guys probably don't form committees, but your council probably does. You may see occasionally where the council blah, blah, blah committee is going to be meeting. Sometimes those committee meetings are set up in such a way that they are not subject to the Open Public Meetings Act. But more often these days, even when a council creates a committee, they're going to do it in an open public session. It's just not safe to draw little thin distinctions in when you're going to comply with the OPMA and when you're not. So the first premise is everything that you folks do is at least subject to the OPMA. So we need to know, what does the OPMA require and how do we comply with it? Next slide, Kelly. The rule, of course, is that anything that happens in the business of government has to be done through meetings. It has to be done through some kind of resolution or decision-making process. Certainly you create lots and lots of written work product. I get that, but the work of the board or the commission happens when you meet. The trick here is under the OPMA, you can have a meeting that was inadvertent. What do you mean? We have a meeting, right? We come in, we have a meeting. Not exactly. So we need to talk about what it means to have a meeting. Because if you're going to comply with the OPMA, your meeting has to be called, it has to be noticed, there has to be some record of it, all those sorts of formalities to be lawful. It's not the case that meetings and the OPMA only apply when you vote on something. So we need to distinguish here. Is it a meeting when we take a vote? Is it a meeting whenever we just, come and talk about it? Is it a meeting even if it doesn't happen in the conference room? That's exactly what we're going to talk. And no secret ballots, by the way, but that's a different story. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so here we go. What's the definition of a meeting? Here's the key. A meeting is any event where you have the business of the agency being discussed and there is a quorum. It's not where it takes place. It's not whether your clerk knew it was happening and properly noticed it. That's not relevant at all. It's was the business of the agency being taken or being discussed, and was there a quorum? Now, the way the OPMA reads, it's described as action, but I'm going to tell you that's a little bit misleading, and we'll talk about that here in a few months. So you can get from this slide a really critical point. If you've got a quorum present, so what's quorum, right? It's just the bare majority you need to conduct business, whatever that may be. It could be, depending on the site, your library board may be very small. I don't know, you have 5 members. So if you have 3 library board members, you've got a quorum. Now, if you have any discussion whatsoever about the business of the library board, you just had a meeting. It could happen on the ferry dock. It could happen at Starbucks. It often does happen at Starbucks inadvertently. You got to back out of those situations because Kelly didn't know you were going to call a meeting at Starbucks. She didn't notice that, right? So you just violated the OPMA if that happened. Let me do the next slide here. Well, actually, before we do that, I'm sorry, I skipped one there. Yeah, because the OPMA has this very, very functional and not formalistic approach to what is a meeting. It also means that meetings can happen electronically. I think most folks know that by now, but for the folks who maybe haven't been exposed to this, if you have a quorum and you're discussing the business of the agency through some sort of social media forum, if you're doing that by texting, if you're doing that by email, you're still having a meeting. You're still discussing the business of the agency with a quorum. Now, the quorum is virtual, but the case law is very clear about this. There was a case maybe 15 years ago for a school district way down in Southeast Washington around Vancouver, where for the first time, the Supreme Court actually was confronted with a string of emails in which the school board members were talking about a disciplinary action for the superintendent. And the emails were pretty reasonable. I mean, nobody was saying ridiculous things, but somebody said, well, I think that would be excessive. What do you think? And we're forwarding these emails around. And as soon as that hit the magic number to be a quorum, it was a meeting. Violation of the OPMA right there. Getting it? Okay, hands going up. Awesome. Okay. Yes, go ahead. It does. Yeah, it's exactly right. Yeah, that criticism of a public official is typically an exec session issue. That's exactly right. And it was not noticed, and that's why it was a problem. Yeah, you go ahead, sir.
So if you have a meeting, the public's got to be informed.
Right.
If we all went to dinner, had a meeting, public had to know that this board was going to the dinner to have a meeting.
Yeah.
So if you did have that announcement, would that need to be considered legal or illegal?
That would be illegal because you didn't properly notice it. This thing we're doing here tonight. Yeah, I'm sorry, Kelly. I said I was gonna do it. Yeah, we had 2 questions. Thanks for reminding me, Kelly. The first question was just about the case that I was citing, and the question was simply in that that Vancouver area, and it was not Vancouver, but in that Vancouver area case, was the problem that the school board didn't notice the meeting. And even though they were discussing the performance of a public official, which could happen in an exec session, and that's true, it could. The problem was that because they didn't notice it, it was unlawful in the first place. And that was the error in that case. But the next question that came up, gentleman asked a really good question, is the problem with just, gathering at Starbucks or what have you, that there was no public notice. And so when the folks got together and started talking about whatever the business was, the public didn't know about it, couldn't attend. And that is exactly right. That is the problem is if you're going to have a public meeting law, folks need to know about it. They need to be able to come. Now, you can do some special things, like you can call a special meeting, right, on very limited notice. And in fact, what I was going to say a moment ago is this meeting tonight has been called as a public meeting. So if anybody in the community showed up and wanted to come and sit here, they'd be more than welcome to do so. But the key is they have to know about it. You've got to give sufficient notice and allow folks to come. Yes, go ahead. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I will repeat that. That's a great question. All right. So the question is, if you have your meeting, and this is just as common as can be, isn't it? I mean, you have your meeting, you're on a, maybe a fairly tight-knit board, or you've at least got some close friends on the board. It's a smaller town, like we talked about. You finish up the meeting and, good grief, it's late. Let's go get dinner together. Is that okay? The answer is, well, if the speed limit is 70, you're going about 69.5 at that point. And here's why I say that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with having a purely social conversation with fellow members of your board, or, what have you. That's fine. But the problem is that's not how people really work. If you've just finished up the meeting and then you're going to go watch a few innings of the Mariners together, somebody's going to say something about what the meeting was on. That's where you were for the past 2.5 hours. It's human nature. Well, right there. I mean, there's your violation. And there's no sort of de minimis test here. It's not, well, what we talked about was really just nothing. No. It doesn't work like that. It's, as I said earlier, it's not a sort of an interpretation kind of law. It's very, very sort of functional and bright line, really, in terms of kicking out anything that is a potential violation. The other component, and I want to take your question in just a moment, but the other component of what's being raised is not only are you almost certain to drift into something that was discussed in the group session and thereby have a discussion of the business, it's going to look like that's what you do. That's the problem. It's going to look like. And if you all drift out of your whatever meeting and go to the sports bar and watch the Mariners, and somebody from what's the Everett paper? The Everett Herald, isn't it? Yeah. The Everett Herald is down the way, and it sees you come in. It says, oh, funny thing.
That has happened too.
That's happened. I don't know that. I'm making this up as we go. Yeah, it's going to look like you were discussing the business of the agency, and it's almost impossible to disprove it. Right? Okay. Yes, sir. Question.
If I, as a citizen, send an email to the entire city council, if one of them replies back to the.
All right. Good question. Yeah, we're going here. No, passive receipt of information. Okay, that's the phrase. Passive receipt of information is not the kind of interactive exchange that constitutes a meeting. But the question was, if just an email gets sent to a council member, if an email gets sent to you, I think you're on the planning commission. Did I get that right? Yeah, you may get emails, right? And if that's all that happens, that's not an OPMA problem. If you get that email though, and you forward it to on a rolling basis to a couple of other members of the planning commission, and they're commenting as they go, that's no longer the passive receipt of information. You're now having essentially this virtual dialogue. There start to be fine lines that have to be drawn there, because suppose the email gets forwarded in some kind of a, series of communications that take place over the course of a long process, and it's not being actively engaged. Well, that's probably not the same thing. It's just in the comments, because you get emails and all these comments, and you send them around. But certainly if there is an intent, and this is where the Supreme Court's a little wishy-washy itself. If there's no intent to meet, it may not be a meeting. I don't subscribe to that. I've had a lot of OPMA cases, and there is nothing that shows me how I'm going to prove whether my client council members were intending to meet or not intending to meet. If you're discussing business with the agency and there's more than a quorum, the taint is on. It's going to be really hard to show that it wasn't some question of intent. So that's why I don't just speak to the intent question.
That's why I send the emails to all of them. I never do.
Yeah, no question, because they've been trained. They've been trained. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Handling email. The question was, why don't you ever get a reply when you send these emails? Sometimes the reply may be, thank you for your interest. Period. But even then, the practice should be to, acknowledge the email, send back the response, but don't spray it to the rest of the members. And that's exactly why that's
You have
happening.
2 online questions.
Let's take up online. And let's
Okay,
talk to you.
Tina
Yeah, go ahead.
Tina Decker, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Go ahead.
Is the caller there?
She did unmute. Yeah. Tina Decker. Well, she heard me. Oh.
On your computer?
Oh, no.
Good point.
Okay, Tina, I'll have you check that. Let's go on to Shaylin Bates. Can you unmute?
Hi, Kelly. Actually, I was just wanting our wonderful presenter to repeat the questions because I wasn't hearing him, but he did that on his own. So thank you.
Awesome. Okay. All right, I see Tina. Can you try to unmute again?
Does she want to use chat?
Yeah, I may not have chat enabled. Tina, if you can send me an email, I'm happy to ask your question. Yeah. Tina, go ahead and respond to the email I sent out for this meeting and you can ask me the question.
I'm gonna take John's question.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Sir.
I was gonna say the 3 of you, not a 4, went ahead and wasn't up for a forum. We discussed,
Yeah.
it's coming up. What would happen then? Is that be considered a bad move or is that, it's okay?
Well, I'm not gonna say it's okay. If the speed limit is 70, you're probably going about 55. I mean, it's not a violation. But again, here's how this works, right? You have that discussion. And then probably somebody is gonna then interact with one of the folks who wasn't there. Oh, now you've got the point. I had a case several years ago for a municipality, and this is substantially true, but I'm gonna play fast and loose with the details, so it doesn't. The guilty shall go unnamed here, but the municipality wanted to take a trip to the AWC conference down in Linden. Right, the council, a couple of other folks, some staff members, I don't know if planning commissioners went on this, but they want to take a trip down there. And they were careful to drive separately, so they didn't all go in a single city vehicle. They got down there, and then the question was, how are we going to go to the different breakout sessions? Because it was going to be all the council was going. It was going to be the whole 7-member council. How are we going to go to the different breakout sessions? And unfortunately, the city council didn't get along very well. They were almost looking for ways to embarrass each other. Pretty great. Trust me, trouble is my business. So they're all looking for ways to kind of embarrass one another. And what would happen is they would divvy up who was going to go to which breakout session. But then a couple of the council members would come into the room of the breakout session that they had told the other council members they weren't going to go to. And when they got in the room, they announced themselves and said, well, you're going to have to leave. No. I'm allowed to be here. We're just saying that, we need to learn about this issue. We need to know about this funding or, this appropriation or whatever. So you're gonna need to leave. And so they were playing this, this game of the forum's gonna kick you out. Anyway, this became a little bit of a news item. And lo and behold, we got sued over it, right? There are folks out there. This should not surprise anyone. There are folks out there who look for news stories about potential OPMA violations. We'll talk a bit about why here in a few moments. We got sued by one of these OPMA guardians, and those folks typically are pretty accurate in their allegations. They're typically pretty astute in terms of what the OPMA requires. And even in that case, where the city had taken steps to define who's going to have what role, even in that case, when those really stupid kind of harebrained ideas of barging into the meeting, we had to litigate about it. And that was one of those instances where the intent to meet was kind of the issue, because the intent wasn't to meet. The intent was to get sort of a political embarrassment leverage situation on your opponent. But it got us sued, and we wound up having to settle the case and pay money. Yeah, you had a question back there, please. Go ahead.
If it was noticed, then would it have been okay?
You probably could have noticed it, but I don't know if you can have a duly noticed. I just don't know the answer to this because I'm not an expert in the noticing part. That's what our good friends like Kelly do. They do so well. I don't know if you could notice a public meeting in Olympia in a a conference room in a hotel. But technically speaking, if you could have noticed it, yes, you probably could have done it. But I don't think you really could have, practically speaking. All right.
That's my question. 3 people went out to eat. You said, well, they talked to the first, fourth person to be a quorum. Whatever that they didn't talk to that person for 2 days.
Aha.
How long is the quorum?
No answer to that. There's no answer to that. I don't know.
Repeat that, Ken.
Yeah, the question was, if you have that let's say this is a situation where you need 5 members to have a quorum, 4 members, let's say you need 4 members to have a quorum, that's more likely. 3 members go have dinner together. They do talk about the business of the agency. Let's just assume that fact. But it's just 3. And then later they have a parking lot conversation, maybe 2 days later, kids' soccer game, they have that parking lot conversation and whatnot and say, yeah, well, we're at the so-and-so and we were talking about that. And the other person says, well, I wouldn't support that. No way. I don't think so. Is that okay? Or is that a problem? And the answer is, yeah, that is a problem. I mean, maybe at a technical level, you've evaded the strict requirement of a quorum plus action, but it's going to be very, very difficult again to get out of that allegation, if you will, that it was a violation. It's just not a good way to analyze your risk.
You're going 55 and 50 on this.
You're speeding up, yeah, and the cops will pull you over at 70. They don't give you 74, 76, or like that. Okay, let's do the next. And really, that is true. I mean, I've also had a number of judges over the years say, well, I don't think there was anything sinister here. I think this is just truly inadvertent, but the law says what it says, and there's no gimme. If you're in a violation, you're in a violation, and that's going to have serious consequences, like we talked about, or like I will talk about. I think you've kind of got the idea that the definition of the meeting based on taking action is not what I'm focusing on tonight, right? Because what I've been saying is not if you go and you discuss action, or if you take action, or you vote. What I've been saying tonight is if you go and you discuss the business of the agency. You've heard me use that phrase several times. And here's why. Action is testimony. That's obviously going to occur in a situation like this. Deliberating and discussing is very open-ended, right? Deliberating and discussing can be about anything, anywhere. And the OPMA never really says that action has this super expansive concept, but that's exactly how courts interpret it. So if you're conducting a hearing, you're having a meeting. The reason we talk about it, the reason it's a liability risk is because it happens inadvertently when you don't even think you're having a meeting. And then if you're doing, reviews and evaluations, it's pretty obvious that that's a meeting. Now, one of the things we've been kind of touching on here throughout is do you have to do everything? If it's this expansive, this broad, do you have to do everything in meeting? And I think most folks who have been doing this for a while have seen executive sessions called. And folks who haven't been doing it for a while have probably watched others call executive sessions. So how far can those go? Are those a good tool to avoid OPMA problems? The answer is, well, they're not a good tool to avoid open public meetings. They're a good way to do things in executive session that the law allows you to do in executive session, but that's it. So the key here is to understand that if you're going to have an executive session, you have to know why you're doing it. You have to announce it in advance, and then you've got to stay within exactly what you said you were doing in the exec session. And there's no exec session that's going to cover 95% of your board or committee or commission work. There may be an exec session that's going to cover a very, very slender part of it. Typical exec sessions can be based on, next slide, Kennedy, can be based on things like discussing litigation risk. And the average, year of work by a board or a commission, how often are you interacting with your city attorney in that setting? Not very often. As your planning commission may have some kind of intense quasi judicial hearing that it's got to make a recommendation on. Yeah, you may need to break out and get advice directly from the attorney, but even that's going to be pretty rare. If you're on the council, you may have executive sessions for things like discussing collective bargaining positions, right? That's a different thing. You're not going to be dealing with collective bargaining on the library commission. You may need to have an exec session if you're on council to consider the price that Lake Stevens would be willing to pay to buy a piece of property. Because if the public generally has knowledge of what you're willing to pay for a piece of property, you don't get a very fair deal, right? So there's an exec session topic, but they're few and far between. Certain personnel issues can be done in exec session. So just realize that exec sessions exist, and absolutely never on your own say, well, I think we should go into exec session. Don't say that. Don't think, well, this is getting hot and heavy. I think we need to pause and talk about this. If you think it's getting hot and heavy, and it's because there's some concern of litigation risk, even then, the only way you can have the exec session is to have the attorney there and give you attorney-client privileged communications. It's not just because you want to discuss something quote unquote confidential. All right. So I've been saying it really matters. You can just hit the next button because you don't want to get an F on this. Okay. Here's why it really matters. I mean, here's kind of the upshot of it. The reason it's so important to tune in on this is because OPMA liability is personal to the individuals who violate the OPMA. As a person volunteering for a board or a commission, you almost always, in doing your actions within the parameters of your role, you almost always are going to be covered by the city's indemnification policy. You're almost always going to be named as an additional insured in terms of the insurance coverage that backs up the indemnification policy. Those are great things, and it's nice to be able to have that. You're also typically going to have what's called immunity if you get sued over some kind of decision you make. it's kind of a shocker sometimes, but planning commissioners or city council members or whatnot, they make a hard decision, sometimes do get sued. And they get sued in their individual capacity. And you see that lawsuit and it names you and your spouse as a defendant. And I think, oh my gosh, why am I doing this again? But the answer to some extent is, well, if you just did it through the ordinary channels, then you're gonna be backed up. You're gonna be backed up by the city. That's not necessarily the way the OPMA works. Because what the OPMA says is it's a penalty. And it goes on, it says it's a penalty that is personal to the person who violated. And I've had different cities split over how they handle this. I've had some cities and counties acknowledge that they will indemnify an OPMA violation. And I've had other situations where they say we can't because it's a penalty. I mean, the legislature said, and we can't pay public money to defray the penalty of a violation of one of our commission members. The point is, you just don't want to have this conversation. Right? It's very uncomfortable. And you may see the next line right after the heading there. Oh, it's $500, up to $1,000 if there's multiple violations. Well, I know it's not great, but gosh, I mean, $500. I guess I can cough that up if I had to. I'm not going to violate the law. Well, the reality is that's not that innocuous at all. The $500 is kind of tip of the iceberg, because if you're caught up in a lawsuit, the difficulty of getting rid of the case can easily exceed the $500. There's also some uncertainty in Washington if the $500 is per violation or whether multiple violations sort of cumulatively can pile up. Here's an example of how that can happen. I was working with a client, it was about 2 years ago, that had just recently gone to hybrid meetings. So everybody got the governor's order on COVID protocols, suspending some of these laws for a very short period of time. And then everybody adapted pretty quickly to doing online only. But then the governor's proclamation started to evolve, as we all know. And they evolved in a way that began to allow hybrid meetings like right here. Right? But this community had not exactly matched up the hybrid approach in a way that fully complied with the noticing process. And again, I'm no expert on the noticing requirements, so I can't tell you exactly what did wrong. But they were noticing it partly correctly and partly incorrectly. But here's the thing, they kept doing it for quite a while before it came to their attention that they were messing up the noticing process. One of these loyal public guardians of the OPMA caught them out, sued, and in the lawsuit, the allegations were that they had violated the OPMA some 44 times or whatever, right? Because they kept doing it. They didn't have any malicious intent, but they were just blasting right along, having meetings that weren't technically in compliance with the OPMA. Well, in that particular case, in fact, the jurisdiction's chief legal officer, I'm outside counsel for most of these things. I'm never sort of in the first row decision making. I'm dealing with consequences. But this particular lawyer decided that he could not provide indemnification under these circumstances. And so that meant that these individual council members were being alleged to have piled up multiple $500 and then $1,000 violations. I don't know what the math is, but it became thousands and thousands of dollars. And again, because there was a violation, we had to litigate the case to a point where we could settle it. And that was a big drag. It was a big drag, and everybody's enthusiasm. It created a lot of wasted time. And ultimately, it was a case where we did again have to pay some money. So I said earlier, why are these things so vigorously enforced? And it's because that a violation also awards attorney's fees to the successful plaintiff. You don't have to have a position in Lake Stevens. You can live in Spokane. You can live wherever you want to live. And if you catch wind that there's an OPMA violation across the state, you can file that complaint. There's a handful of lawyers out there who actually specialize in bringing OPMA and PRA violations, and they're happy to take these cases because they will get their attorney's fees paid. They know they will. So there's, I mean, this is by design. I mean, the legislature says we don't want these things to slip by. We want there to be enforcement, and the attorney general can't be everywhere all the time. So it comes down to what's called a private attorney general concept, and it leads to you know, these things having serious teeth. Also, you need to understand that if there's no PMA violation, then whatever you voted on will be voided. Think back to that client that I was sort of obscurely talking about a few moments ago, where they had conducted all this business, these 40 some odd meetings. If pressed, the judge would have had to declare all of those meeting results void. Right? That maybe that just means there's a whole bunch of do-overs, but sometimes you can't have a do-over. Right? Suppose you're involved in a planning commission, suppose you're involved in a planning commission meeting, and you've got some kind of subdivision consideration, or some other kind of you know, really clear site-specific action, rezone, you know, some other kind of processing that on the Lake Stevens Code may come to you, and you make your vote, and for whatever reason there's an OPMA problem. And it turns out after litigating it for a while that you're in the wrong and the judge is going to have to void your decision. The problem is that in the real world, somebody may have been relying upon that decision all the way up to that point. Somebody may have arranged for a construction loan. Somebody may have actually started mobilized equipment. Somebody may have started for foundations, and it's void. Right? You're stuck. I mean, you're on the hook. And the OPMA violation is going to turn into a damages case. You know, one of the things I should have said, and I'm going to touch on it really briefly here. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner, all of these slides have this Washington State Insurance Authority. I should make clear, I do a lot of defense work through WCIA. Lake Stevens is a member of WCIA. WCIA is this municipal risk pooling association. It's not an insurance company. They're very careful to tell you it's not an insurance company. It's a municipal risk pool or risk sharing arrangement. WCA does great things in terms of providing defense counsel in anticipation of claims, sometimes heading claims off before they even become claims. I give this talk frequently for WCIA. WCA does not cover OPMA violations. Okay, they're not going to help you on this. The next one.
Just doing a time check. It's 7:40 or
Yep.
7:38.
7:38.
And I've got one online question, but it's not related to this topic. So let me know when you want to take it.
Sure. Now it's good.
Okay. This is from a park board member who says, if at the Parks Board meeting, they're asking our opinion on what playground equipment we like to feel out what direction to go, do our individual responses need to be put into the written meeting minutes, or can a summary be written? This is not an official vote.
Yeah, there's no OPMA issue here. The question is a good one. And I think it seems like there's nuance being lost, then it may be more helpful to explain it in detail in the meeting minutes.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's a right or wrong way. Minutes get taken with all kinds of different levels of detail.
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah, I'll just speak from the city council. For what I do is usually a recap. The consensus was
That's-
such and such, unless the council members want it on record as to exactly how they voted.
Yep, fair
So,
enough.
yeah.
Fair enough. Okay, appearance of fairness doctrine. So we're off the OPMA. We're gonna hold, you've heard enough on that. You're gonna be able to spot the issue. You're gonna avoid the danger zones. And, you know, if you think there's a problem, you know, brewing, just back out, you know, say, I'm sorry, I can't talk to you about this, or I need to leave, or whatever. That guy came, we talked about it. Remember that? You know, whatever it is that gets you out of the situation, that's what you have to do. It's awkward, but you need to be able to take that level of action if you see it coming. I said we talked about the appearance of fairness doctrine pretty briefly, and we will. I just want you to understand what it is and when it comes up. This is the point where if you're not on the planning commission of the civil service, you just stop and not worry about what I'm going to say for a few minutes. If you are, though, you need to know that there are a handful of things that may come before you where you have yet another type of transparency law, if you will, that you have to fulfill. The appearance of fairness doctrine, let me go ahead and do the next slide. The appearance of fairness doctrine kicks in when you are taking a quasi-judicial action. More jargon, right? Okay, but this is not too bad. A quasi-judicial action means you're hearing a dispute over identified property, and somebody is going to prevail or not based on what happens in that site-specific decision. It's an awkward way to say it. I appreciate that, but here's a way to make it clear. Contrast that with general planning. If you're considering planning policies for affordable housing or historic preservation or traffic prioritization or some kind of community recreational, how many parks per, park acres per capita do we want to have, whatever those things may be. Those are not quasi-judicial. You don't have to worry about the appearance of fairness doctrine. You worry about the appearance of fairness doctrine in Lake Stevens when you have something like a hearing examiner recommendation that's coming to a city council decision. I know I don't have council members here tonight, but that would be a quasi-judicial action. If you have a planning commission recommendation, I looked up your code on these, by the way, that's how I'm looking at my notes, or why I'm looking at this. If you have a planning commission recommendation going to a city council decision on something like a development agreement or a plat alteration, for instance. And I understand these may be pretty few and far between. You're in a potential appearance of fairness issue if the city attorney asks you if you have any appearance of fairness disclosures. Right, you've seen that probably. Do we have any appearance of fairness disclosures? And it doesn't come up often, again, but what it's getting at is this. If you've had some kind, let me hit the next slide here, Kelly.
Oh, go ahead and hit the next.
Yeah,
slide.
go.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yep.
There you go. Does not apply to general comprehensive planning, area-wide rezones, zoning amendments, area-wide significance. And the next slide, too, we're going to make up some time here. Yeah. When it kicks in is if you've had some kind of contact with the proponent of the project or the opponent of the project. So again, really all this comes down to something that's site specific, and somebody is the developer or is particularly interested in opposing it, and they come to you and they say, well, I really think you need to understand why we're opposed to this. You've now had what the law calls an ex parte contact. What that means is you're now influenced by something that took place outside the open public meeting. So these things work together, right? The open public meeting means that everybody gets to come see it happen. The media can be there and report on it. That's great. So everybody knows. But if you had special contacts, then what happened in the public meeting isn't really what happened. Because you had some influence that was extraneous to the meeting, and nobody else knew about that. Okay, that's an appearance of fairness violation. So if you do have some sort of inadvertent contact outside the meeting, you've got to disclose it. And that's why these things lead off with does anybody have any appearance of fairness disclosure? The best rule here is don't have the ex parte contacts in the first place. You can't always help it, of course. But if you do have an ex parte contact, make sure you get it on the record. If you get it on the record, that is, you say, well, yes, actually, I did have an ex parte contact. What did you discuss? Well, we talked about this for a minute, and I said, no, I can't. Was that going to influence you in any way? No, it's not. Okay, but if the conversation was lengthier, it's going to be really, really difficult to say it doesn't have some influence over you. And if you disclose it, you may then be asked to recuse yourself, or you may be obligated to recuse yourself. So one of the reasons this thing is kind of self-policing is if you really care about why you're on the planning commission, don't lose your vote by having these ex parte contacts, because then you're no good. You can't actually do what you were there to do. So stay clear. And I think it goes without saying, but here's how it actually, here's how it rubbers the road. If you have some other kind of bias, if you have some other kind of personal involvement in an issue, every now and then somebody who is really vested in the development community, or is in a sort of a very focused environmental perspective, will be approach you, or maybe your spouse, maybe it's your spouse is a realtor who's got a commission on a particular project. There's a direct financial involvement. Those are examples where you need to disclose. And I think it's kind of obvious if you've got that sort of feeling that maybe this is a biased situation, that you don't want to run the risk of doing it regardless and having it blow up later. Disclose it. It's by far the best policy. Yes, question.
Just a case in point. So when we were on planning commission back in who knows when, we had an applicant that was trying to get a second marijuana retail store.
Yeah.
And like Stevens approached each and every one of us individually, he came to my office in Bellevue and was trying to win over individual votes. And so we all had to universally, when we came to the next meeting, say if we had undue influence,
Yeah.
and you vote on this, yes or no.
Yeah.
And so that was a prime example of one, how not to get planning commission to understand your case, but two, all of us have to individually say, have we been approached, and
Yeah.
and whether or not that was going to influence it.
Well, folks in the community don't understand this, and they don't.
And just a reminder to repeat that if you could.
Well, there's
There's no need to repeat it. Just,
Yeah.
Okay.
I was giving an example of something.
there was a comment.
Yeah,
There's a
it was a comment of somebody who was on a planning commission that the applicant was contacting all of the commission members to
Yeah.
get, to try to sway their vote.
Yeah, I was going to expand on it a little bit and hopefully kind of illustrate the
Yeah.
reason it's a good comment, because folks in the community don't understand this, and they want to have influence. They want, they're doing what they think is the right thing. And if it's not a quasi judicial matter, it's not quite as troubling. But the reality is, even though you've got constituents, and I again know you're not elected, so you don't literally have constituents, but you want to look responsive, right? I mean, you want to acknowledge this, and you want to look like you're their representative. It's fine, but it's not the right way to provide the influence. They need to be invited. And that goes back to the first part of the presentation, right? Give people opportunities, and they won't necessarily feel like they've got to confront you at the start. Let's leave the appearance of fairness document behind. The last section is Public Records Act, PRA. The Public Records Act is also a very serious business, like the OPMA. It operates a little differently in terms of the litigation risk. One of the things that you need to understand about the Public Records Act is that there's no limit in terms of the potential exposure that the city has under the Public Records Act. With the OPMA, it's unpleasant for sure, but the PRA can really result in some pretty extraordinary allegations and claims. So this slide says, of course, public records of government are going to be open. The next bullet point there is it's pretty dramatic. The free and open examination of public records in the public interest, even though such examination may cause inconvenience or embarrassment to public officials or others. Anything is a public record if it is dealing with the business of the agency. Yeah, the little picture there is kind of it's somebody like some hero slaying this multi-headed dragon, and it's subject to interpretation. If you're involved in a PRA case, it feels like you're trying to slay the records, because in these cases there could be so many records. I can't hardly convey enough how in the electronic era, particularly now, so many different forms of social media, so many different types of access, and just the volume of records, how it can be so challenging to just hack your way through. But the other interpretation of that might be that that the Hydra is the government. It's the hero who's trying to slay the beast of government by making public records. Okay, let's do the next slide. I keep going through this. The issue here is that these get to be really, really big cases. Hundreds of thousands of dollars get spent settling public records cases because the volume of records can be so large. And again, we have attorney's fees being recovered for successful plaintiffs. MESA is the next to last bullet point. Little bitty community outside of Tri-Cities. MESA's population is maybe 800 people, something like that. MESA got hit with a public records case, as you can see there, about $350,000. They had increased their general tax assessment throughout the community to pay for this. They were actively talking about filing bankruptcy because they didn't have the assets. And the Public Records Act doesn't care. It doesn't matter. A small town can be just as liable as King County. Yeah, question.
The public record act, didn't they start charging more money to people that want all these records, because people just constantly ask?
Oh, yeah, okay. Not exactly, no. In fact, if you want specialized electronic access, if you want specialized electronic access, there can be a fee to tailor that for you. There can also be reasonable copying costs. But otherwise, no, there is no sort of throttle on the requester. They can request about anything they want to. And you are highly, highly encouraged to make the records available in an electronic manner that won't require a charge. It'll be free.
That's what King County put in, where they would charge you, because these people are coming in and asking for hundreds of thousands of documents.
Yeah.
I can see why they don't go back.
Well, the charge for records does not impede access. I mean, it may limit the copying costs. It may limit the agency's obligation to create specialized forms of records, but it otherwise does not actually limit the access. The question was whether or not you can charge for records and whether or not that can sort of hinder frivolous requests. The answer is no. The PRA doesn't have any concept of frivolous records. People can ask for whatever they want to ask for. Let's do the next slide here, Kelly. So, public record officer, Kelly, are you a public records officer?
I am.
Yeah. So your city clerk is public records officer. It's her job to get the requests, acknowledge them, and that's not your role. But your role as a commission member or a committee member or board member is to be able to help Kelly fill that public records request. She's going to provide the requester notice that they're going to get everything they're entitled to, but then the city has to be able to get its arms around whatever that requester is asked for. And that may implicate lots and lots of records that you create. Okay, so be aware that when you're doing your library board, veterans commission, obviously planning commission, what have you, civil service, you are creating public records all the time. Particularly your emails are public records. Your texts are public records. If they deal with the business of the agency, all of those things are public records. Now, Kelly's job is going to be to come get them. You need to think about, why am I creating all these public records? And am I creating them in a way that will be easily identifiable so that Kelly can do her part of the job and we can avoid one of these, $500,000 losses. So partly it has to do with being alert to the fact that you're creating the records, not being sloppy about how you manage them. But it partly also has to do with some tech savvy. So let's get to that. You have a question or you just want to make a comment?
Or can I just make a quick comment? This is a great segue into, we will be issuing city email addresses to all of you within the next month or so. So be watching for that. We'll do some training on how that's going to work, but hopefully you'll see, I know it'll be a little more difficult to check 2 email addresses, but you'll see that you can keep all of your city related business on your city email address. So that if we do get that public records request, I can go to that email box and pull out what I need to. And you're not intermingling your personal and trying to decipher between, a one email address. So more to come on that.
Kelly and I actually worked that out. I mean, so that.
Yeah.
This is not totally impromptu. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So here's the key. Once you get that city email address, boy, be extremely disciplined. Keep your city business through your city email address. Okay, don't use your personal email address. Hey, Kelly, will you have any system that will back up texts to your server in the future? Or is it just gonna be email?
Yeah, they're not going to get city issued phones.
And okay, it's
So
not gonna be a system that
no.
the city gonna track their individual. Okay,
not
well
at this time.
then folks, don't text.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, don't text city business.
Yeah.
Okay, you use the city email account if you got an email. And don't use text period. Okay,
Yeah.
that's the takeaway there. And frankly, in the meantime, I would strongly encourage you, don't use your personal email either. Wait until you get that city account. I realize, all these years, like Steven says, has not had personal email accounts for its board and commission members. But once you've got that, stick to it. And really, it has a really tangible impact because, and as Kelly points out, if you use your city account, she's got it.
Mhm.
She's got it. She doesn't have to come bug you. If you don't, or if you create records on your own personal system that are city material, she's got to come ask you, do you have records on your personal laptop? Do you have records on your cell phone? Because I don't have them. You're not using your city account. This is before you had your city account. And if you get involved in the world of PRA litigation, you can be asked to sign an affidavit that says under penalty of perjury that I do not have any of these. Or if you do, and you can't sign that affidavit, you may have to offer up your phone or your personal desktop computer or your laptop or whatnot to some third-party forensic IT person who will do a search. That can be pretty intrusive. Nobody really wants that. So really, this is what I say. There's a certain amount of sort of philosophy of PRA, and a certain amount of just being smart and sticking with the program. You're creating records all the time, so don't create them the way it's going to make personal assets the point of it. Make sense? Let's go on. Wrap it up a little bit. It's pretty obvious. I think I've already alluded to this one. Anything is a public record. You just see the definition there and all the time. Any writing containing information relating to the conduct of government. There's basically no clear limit on what that excludes. So if it has something to do with the business of the agency, you bring from that doesn't have a performance and of course. This is the Kelly intensive slide. He's the one that has to understand what they're asking, which makes sense. The second bullet point is version kind of funny. The PRA requires that an active search and being active both in verifying potentially things like the declarations to make sure she's done her job because Kelly doesn't know that stuff. I mean, she's been doing this for
For some reason, they're telling me it's hard to hear you. I don't know if that mic went out.
Oh. Hello, testing.
Yeah.
And the battery may have died. Okay, well, for those online, I'm really sorry about that. I did not know. Okay, excellent. And here we are in the home stretch. But what I was just saying here is your staff, sometimes public records requests are fairly manageable. If somebody really needs to know something and you can get that filled. I'm sure Kelly's had that experience a lot. Sometimes though, the folks don't understand what they're asking for and they get annoyed. And then they start to dig in and they can make the request even more difficult to fulfill. And when that happens, it just makes it all that much more difficult for Kelly to understand when she's provided an adequate answer. The thing you can do is at least maintain some discipline over how you kept your records. Okay, Kelly, let's do the next one. I think I've touched on this. It has to have that attorney's fees shifting clause. So it's pretty easy for plaintiffs to get interested when they think there's a violation. We don't need to spend a lot more time on this one, Kelly. You know, there's an issue that comes up sometimes in terms of how long you need to hold records. Are all records equally important? I wouldn't let that slide really slow us down much, because for your purposes, again, your primary function is not to worry about the state archivist record retention policies. It's just get them in Kelly's hands. Yeah, no, you've got a great big book that tells you how long you've got to keep everything, but make sure that Kelly gets them in the first place. Next slide. Websites are records. Social media participation creates a public record. Right. I think we know that emails are records, but communications in social media is also a public record. I've said earlier a little bit about, you know, maintaining some discipline in your public records system of communication. Another thing to really focus on is just, you know, just kind of being a little more reticent in email. I mean, sometimes folks will just email the craziest things and at length. You know, long, multiple chains of emails and reply all and forwarding everything that comes their way. I've got a law partner. I don't know why he does. He just will create so many emails, you know, emails to say thank you and thank you. And, you know, so many emails and well, here's the thing, you know, he's a super gregarious guy and he's just thanking people. But sometimes people don't really need to get an email that says thank you. You know, so people just want to have their email box, you know, trimmed down. Thank you. That's the key. That's the key, is every time you do it, you're creating a record. And every time you're creating a record, Kelly's got to track it. And if she misses it, it's a violation. Now, the thank you email, yeah, probably it's not that big a deal. The point, though, is try to have try to be a little bit more disciplined, because you are working for an agency. You are part of government here, and just your personal habits will start to pile up, and they'll either be good habits or they'll be not such good habits. We want good habits. Okay, next slide. The thing I'm trying to get across here, kind of like with the OPMA, is just don't look for ways to wiggle through the loopholes. Just endorse the fact that you're going to have this transparency obligation. And if you meet that head on and you listen to a tenth of what I said tonight, you're not going to have any trouble. Okay. And if you do see some issue on the horizon and it's a PRA issue or an OPMA issue, spot it and go to Kelly, or find out how you're going to get access to your city attorney. When it's a concrete problem and there are specific facts, go get those identified and have that discussion. Not necessarily in an open public meeting. That can be an attorney-client conversation. That's enough on that slide. Let's end it there. Yeah, I'm going to be here for a little bit longer. Everybody's free to leave. It is 8:02, so we did okay there. But if I'd be happy to take questions if folks want to pitch them to me. So anybody can get up and leave. That's a great question. Yeah, why don't I repeat that? Because we may have folks, are we still on the Zoom or did you close? Yeah, that's a really good, I do kind of draw, again, folks, I want to end on time. So folks just get up and leave for all I care. But the question here is a good one. The question is, how do you, I'm going to elaborate a little bit. But the question basically, I think, is if a member of a board gets a request, somebody says, well, how do I get this? What do you do about that? And the first answer that I think Kelly was leading to is go to Kelly and tell her you got this. The reality, though, is you really have to handle that carefully, because under the PRA, an oral request for records can be a perfectly valid request. And you owe the requester a response within 5 days. You being the city, not you as the board member. The city owes a response. Now, the response may be, we got your request and it's going to take us 6 weeks to gather the records. That's perfectly fine, but you got to get that response in 5 days or you violate the OPMA. I'm sorry, you violate the PRA right there. So if you are asked, how do I find this? Boy, just get it to Kelly right away. Right away, because it can otherwise lurk and be a real problem. And Kelly may not know about it until maybe 2 or 3 weeks later. And that's a bad way to get the thing started. Good question. Good question.
There was one more question on the line. If you take notes during a meeting, are the notes part of the public record?
Oh, there's a debate about that. I think this person must know that. Okay. All right. Well, if you take notes that are solely intended for your public purpose, let me forget it. If they're solely intended for your private purpose, in other words, you're just taking notes to help yourself remember what's being said, and you don't intend for them to have any value, and they're solely for your purposes, they're solely for your personal involvement, they may not be a public record. But there's not clear case law in that. And so if the person asking the question is trying to trip me up, what I'm going to say is, yes, those probably are public records, unless your city attorney is willing to tell you, oh, don't worry about it. So if you're up at the dais and you're sitting there scribbling away, I don't think it's safe to tear those off and just throw them away at the end of the hearing. I think you need to retain those and make them available if requested. Now, again, this is a gray area, and I'll be the first to admit that I don't think there's clear-cut case law on that, but be aware that you are probably creating a public record. I don't know why you aren't. I mean, I'm aware that there is some hint that they may not be. There's some good resources on all of this stuff at the MRSC website. So if you want to dig into this in a little more detail, the MRSC website is a great sort of booklet online for OPMA and PRA. You could find some topics like this in that resource. Yeah, go right ahead. Yeah.
And have common projects and common things. Is that a conflict? There may be maybe there's no financial interest.
Yeah, I don't think that's not a recognizable conflict for any of the transparency laws. Okay, that's not a recognizable conflict for any of the public transparency laws we've been talking about tonight, Kelly. It's difficult to say that's a completely safe harbor. I mean, there could be areas where involvement in a committee for the city that also has some kind of a private, analog, veterans might be one, Parks and Rec might be another. It's difficult to say that's always going to be smooth sailing. I mean, there could be areas where you have an interest in the non-city affair that starts to look like it could bias or prejudge your role in the city affair. So just kind of keep an eye on that. And if you have specific facts and a specific question comes up, again, get it to Kelly, because it's probably not going to be an issue, but you need to have it identified if you're concerned about it. You had a question, sir?
Yes, so going back to that, you said an oral request for public records.
Yes,
official.
it can be. Yeah.
But how, right? If it says, hey, I'm trying to figure out how I get.
Oh, okay.
record of this meeting versus,
Yeah.
hey, I would like a record of this meeting. How do I go about doing that? Right?
Yeah, no, that's a great way to approach it.
Any city representative that requests to go come in?
The best response is to say, I need you to go to City Hall and fill out, or you need to go online. I mean, I'm sure you guys have electronic records requests. Yeah, I need to go online and ask for that. Make sure it gets,
Good enough.
that's good enough. Yeah, yeah.
There's a 5-day statute. That is the end of the 5 days. We've satisfied their request by saying you should go online and submit a request.
If you have a procedure and you direct them to that procedure, okay, and then they fulfill that procedure, you've done what you need to do. If it's ambiguous over whether or not they follow up and they say, well, he told me it would be fine, that's where the gray area comes in. Okay, because you're not going to necessarily be the master of the allegations. They may make the allegation, right? And then you're having to defend it. So even though you tell them, you know, we've got this process, I need you to go fill this out, which is really routine. I'd still let Kelly know, hey, they were asking me. They were asking me for this record.
She at least has awareness that somebody may come ask.
Yeah.
her.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, exactly right.
So,
Exactly right.
they'll make the request.
Kelly may want to reach out at that point and say, I understood you asked, you know, commission member so-and-so about this, you know, what are you looking for? And there's all kinds of ways that sometimes you have to be sort of anticipating the requester doesn't exactly know what he or she is doing, and you've got to meet them halfway.
Sometimes we also know who the requester is, right?
Yeah.
Or that's person, hey, I'm trying to get the property.
Yeah, no, that's,
It's then on us to take their name and email.
no, that's a great question though, because you're pointing out that the sort of the letter of the law seems to lead to these, you know, implausible scenarios.
Us to get that to them. They just have to ask and form.
And that's not the way it's going to work, right? I mean, obviously that takes it a step farther, but you know, be on the prowl for that kind of fact pattern and get Kelly's involvement early. That's the best thing to do, is be proactive about the risk. Not a clear-cut answer. I mean, there really isn't there. Awesome. Okay. Well, thanks everybody. It was a lot of fun. Glad you had me.